well. 2 weeks ago, we announced this year's high school student college scholarship recipients, Lev Working for our junior award and Beckett Green for our senior award, and our two other finalists, Megan China and Edward Rupar. Each of these students' works will be featured in this year's edition of the Hemingway Shorts. We have just concluded our short story contest, and in early May, we will be also announcing our short story winner and 10 finalists for publication in the 6th edition of Hemingway Shorts, our annual literary journal. We invite you to go to our website, hemingwaybirthplace.com, to learn more about us, our programming, and to support us by becoming a foundation member, or you can go to our savehemingway.com to support our Keep Our Doors Open GoFundMe campaign. Hopefully everyone has been able to take in the Burns Novick PBS 3-part series on Hemingway earlier this month. Tonight's talk is a fitting origin story as well, as we welcome Dr. Michelle Moore to discuss her book, Chicago and the Making of American Modernism, Cather, Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, in Conflict. Dr. Moore considers the connection between famed 20th century writers in Chicago and the extent to which their surroundings affect their art. She is a professor of English at the College of DuPage, and amongst her affiliations serves as a board member of the Hemingway Foundation. Moderating tonight's discussion will be Laura Young, author and English teacher, as well as the current writer-in-residence for the Hemingway Foundation. We encourage you to submit questions via the chat box. Please note all questions to be asked are at the discretion of the moderator. We will also be live streaming and recording this talk via our Facebook page. And now, let me turn things over to Laura to begin this discussion with Dr. Moore.
Good evening. Hi. Hi, everyone out there. Dr. Moore?
How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Hi, good.
Good, wonderful. So we are here for a discussion about your book. If you wanted to, if there's anything you wanted to add to Keith's introduction, or anything you wanted to talk about in regards to the inception of your book, or sort of where it came, where this idea came from, what the genesis was, I kind of will leave it up to you to go into as much detail as you want.
Okay, well, to start, this book really was a 9-year endeavor, and the seed for it was not with Hemingway, which you would think, considering Hemingway is really the only writer in that subtitle that is clearly from Chicago, from Oak Park. The seed was with Willa Cather. When I was a junior in college, I had a wonderful American literature professor who was very much into Willa Cather, and she taught that class The Song of the Lark, 1915 novel by Cather, and I absolutely adored it. In fact, I became obsessed with it. I write the final paper on it, and it's the story of a young girl's movement from a small town across the prairie to Chicago, and then finally to New York, and then to Europe to become an opera singer. Along the way, she meets a young man who owns an entire canyon of cliff dwellings in Arizona. And that's where she really has an awakening. That's where everything comes together for her. That's where she figures out where her voice comes from. And I thought as a young woman that this was just really cool, that this was a roadmap, a way in which a young female, at that time writer, academic, who wanted to see a path forward, I was being given something by Cather. So I began to give this novel as presents to my friends, and then later to my students as a graduation gift. Well, when I moved to Chicago, I was reading a handbook of things to do in Chicago, interesting things, and discovered there was a Cliff Dwellers Club here. And I'd never heard of that before. It's not something ever mentioned to me on the East Coast, never mentioned in grad school. And I thought, well, the middle chapter of Song of the Lark, this character Thea moves to Chicago and has a hard time. But then the cliff dwellings somehow free her from that. And that's when I began to start to see that what Cather had actually written was a critique of Chicago of 1915. And so that took me right to the archive. I was lucky enough to live close to the Chicago History Museum. They have a wonderful archive in there, and to the Newberry Library. And I began to start to poke through letters, what was available, anything I could find in order to support this reading that was emerging. Well, this reading turned into a journal article that was published in Cather Studies. And then from there, I found a publisher that gave me a contract based on this one chapter on Willa Cather and Chicago. Because what I began to see and find as I continued to teach Chicago novels, as well as Faulkner, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and continue to do Hemingway, continue to do the archival research, I found that other writers were thinking about and writing about Chicago too, and that this was not something I had ever heard in modernist studies before. It wasn't something mentioned, and there were entire sections of these novels that were dedicated to Chicago, but somehow we skip over that because it's not New York, it's not Paris, it's not San Francisco if you're Dashiell Hammett, right? It's the middle of the country, it's flyover country. And so I think a lot of scholars and writers and readers are able to just skip over those sections without thinking about it. And then the book really took fire when I got that contract and was able to expand it in the way I had envisioned. So it was really a labor of love for about 9 years. And then
Wow.
for the last 3 years.
Okay. All right. Wow. That's it's stunning. And something you touched upon that was a question I was going to ask you as it relates to Hemingway, because I thought we could start by talking about him a little bit, and that section of the book. For those of you out there who have not seen the book, here's the book here, Chicago and the Making of American Modernism. And one of the questions I had actually was, how do you think, how did the text Cliff Dwellers influence Hemingway, in your opinion? Like, what did you find in your research?
Well,
if you could narrow it, I mean, not that, like, I'm sure it's like huge, right?
Cliff Dwellers is a novel that was written by Henry Blake Fuller. And the Cliff Dwellers Club, which is still in existence in Chicago, took its name rather unceremoniously from the novel. And I say unceremoniously because Hamlin Garland, who was forming the Cliff Dwellers Club, he went in and poached members from a club called the Little Room that was very near and dear to Harry Blake Fuller's heart. So much so, and Fuller was so upset with what Garland was doing forming the Cliff Dwellers Club that he refused to join. Fuller refused to join this new club. And so he was very upset when they just appropriated and took his name from his novel for this new club. So the novel, The Cliff Dwellers, which is written by Fuller during and right after the Colombian Exhibition in Chicago. In that novel, Fuller writes about the canyons of Chicago and how the sun, and this is a true thing, the sun lines up on certain days of the year so that we have a kind of equinox in Chicago. And so he talks about these canyons of Chicago, and he writes about the newly created skyscrapers as cliff dwellings where apartments are raised up in the mountains, in the hills, in the canyon, and their inhabitants are the cliff dwellers. And so when Fuller, when then his name was being appropriated, the novel's name was appropriated for the club, it was being done so because the Cliff Dwellers Club perches at the top of a building as this new arts club in Chicago. Now, what's interesting is Hemingway actually didn't have a direct association with this club. And the reason why is because Hemingway's mentor, Sherwood Anderson, showed up in Chicago just a little late to be with this older group of writers and artists who originally formed the Little Room Club and then formed the Cliff Dwellers Club. And so Hemingway didn't know these guys personally. Anderson didn't either. He was more interested in a group of young artists who were down in Hyde Park. But Hemingway certainly read this novel and certainly became very interested in the way in which it critiques the city of Chicago as a place in which business is running amok and clamps down on the artists and the artistic clubs in Chicago. And so I think Hemingway very much was influenced by this novel that he most certainly read either in high school or read when he was back in Oak Park doing his rehab after having been shrapnelled in the war, and walking down to the Oak Park Public Library every week, picking up books and bringing them back. He certainly read it, he took it in, and I think that he developed his own ideas about using a critique form from reading Fuller's novel on the Cliff Dwellers.
Very interesting. You know, you talk about this idea of critiquing Chicago, or critiquing aspects of Chicago, I should say, and how also the Chicago as a location, as an artist's colony, is kind of glossed over, right? We, like you said, New York, it's not New York, it's not Paris. But one thing that I was wondering is, so Hemingway, yes, had many ties, obviously we know, to Oak Park, to Chicago as well. And one of the questions I have is, at one point in the Hemingway section, you suggest that there is this outside versus inside persona of Hemingway. That on the outside, or I should say on the inside, he's all about like family ties and being a good son and doing right by his family. But on the outside, so that's on the inside, but on the outside, he wanted to sort of be known as this like estranged modernist. Mm-hmm. Right? Like that's the rebel, the rebellious writer, I suppose. So if you could talk a little bit about those two sides of Hemingway and how they relate to Chicago itself, how they can coexist with each other, because as a writer, and you as a writer, in the end, I think we'd all like to be paid for our writing. We don't necessarily want to live as paupers, right? And yet it wasn't like cool to desire that. And you kind of touched upon that a little bit when you were talking about the book that he was given by his uncle. Mm-hmm. So if you could speak to that.
Okay, so Faulkner, by the time Hemingway was reading Fuller, Hemingway was very much aware that Fuller was kind of old hat. And you can see in his reading that and what he first was publishing, that he was looking for who was going to be who was the great literary celebrity of the day. And Chicago was the literary center of the US when Hemingway was younger, and then also right when he returned to Oak Park to recover from the war, from his war wounds. And the writer who was the biggest literary celebrity when he was younger was Edgar Lee Masters, who wrote Spoon River Anthology. There are newspaper spreads where it's just what Masters and his wife are doing out in the day, pictures, big pictorial spreads. He was this literary celebrity, something we'd never really had before. And I think Hemingway was he saw these pictures for sure. His family would read the Tribune, he would see this. But I think he was really intrigued with this. So then Sherwood Anderson moves to Chicago, and he is also intrigued with literary celebrity. And Sherwood Anderson will write his big collection, Winesburg, Ohio, which is a prose adaptation in some ways of what Masters had done. We can see the imitation. So Hemingway then, when he lives in Chicago in 1920 to 21, gets to know Sherwood Anderson, then the newest literary celebrity. And it becomes clear that Hemingway is interested in this idea of how to make money, of how to be a literary celebrity, where on the one hand, you get to have all the kudos and the appreciation of being a great writer, a great novelist, someone who's doing the new, most amazing, interesting writing, like Masters and Anderson. They were doing this new experimental modernist writing. And yet they were celebrated for it. They were making money. These books were selling. There'd be lines down and around the block from Marshall Fields when Masters was there for a book signing. And I think that's what Hemingway also wanted. He saw in Masters and in Anderson a model for how to begin to fuse money making with literary notoriety and with literary respect, that you could do both. It wasn't one or the other, which is what the European avant-garde artists thought you had to do. But rather it's a Midwestern and particularly a Chicago idea that you can do both. It's a very American idea too. So when Hemingway will go to Europe, he will bring with him what he's learned from Chicago and what he's learned by watching Masters and Anderson. And my chapter actually began in seeing the relationships between these writers and seeing how Masters was a literary celebrity and how Hemingway would have seen this. But when I went off to the JFK Library, where the Hemingway collection is housed in Boston, and I spent a few weeks there, I had the luck of looking through a list and finding a book that had been given to Hemingway by his Uncle Tyler. And when you do archival research, it can get tedious after a while. And because you're just going through files in a box, it's the most unglamorous thing possible. And you are just looking and hunting for that proverbial needle in a haystack. And at a certain point, you need to take a break, but you also have a limited time. So the way in which archival researchers take a break is always very personal to them. I have friends who start going through photographs. The thing I do is I start looking through the lists of the stuff. The better collections, there's always stuff, things that were just saved, newspaper clippings. And in the case of Hemingway, Mary, his fourth wife, had bequeathed his entire book collection to the JFK Library. And in the list of what is in his book collection, I found this book from Uncle Tyler, 1915, How to Make Good or Winning Your Largest Success, a businessman's talks on personal proficiency and character building, the only success insurance. And I didn't know what this was, but another Hemingway had published a book, so I thought this was sort of a big deal. And at this point, I was starting to think of Hemingway as getting interested in business and actually making money. And of course, his family was very good at it. And he comes from a family of good businessmen. The grandfather had been in real estate, and of course, his uncle Alfred's insurance. So it made sense to me that Hemingway would be interested in these things. So I immediately put in the request to the library to get the book. And it takes a while. You need permission. So Tuesday passes. No, Wednesday passes. I'm going to lunch. I'm coming to bed. No, you still haven't been approved. Thursday, I'm approved. Friday, I'm told it'll be available after lunch. That was the quickest lunch I think I've ever eaten in my life. I come and it had been pulled up, and I was told that the archivist had been looking at it and they wanted to know what it was. Why was this so interesting to me? And I said, wait a second, let me look at it. Let me tell you what it is. And I took pictures of it, and let me show you what I found. And I'm going to share my screen. Here's the cover of it. Okay, so that's the cover. And then I opened it. They actually were letting me touch it, which was fantastic. And this is what came up. Ernest Miller Hemingway, from Alfred T. Hemingway, Uncle Tyler, Kansas City, Missouri, June 1917. And that's when I told them what it was. It was Hemingway's graduation present from his Uncle Tyler. And in it, it's a how-to manual of how to be a good, moral businessman while making money. So these were ideas that were not unique to Uncle Tyler, but it was something that Hemingway's entire family would have been interested in. And Uncle Tyler is the one who actually published the book, which was distributed around his area, given as gifts to his workers, secretaries, clients. And June 1917 is right when Hemingway would be graduating from high school. So he is actually given this how-to manual about how to be a good businessman, how to not swindle people, how not to be a con, how to actually produce good work while being good and morally good, that these two things are compatible. So I'm going to stop the screen share. And that, to me, is extremely significant. It's as significant as the fact that it was Mary Hemingway who gave this to the JFK Library, who bequeathed it. So Hemingway kept this book his entire life. It was that important to him. And not only that, it wasn't frayed, rubbed, the binding. No, it had been loved, read, reread. It was super evident that this was something that was important to Hemingway. He looked at it and he took that advice. And so what I write about is how Hemingway is trying to be a good businessman artist, and that he thinks he can do both at the same time. And I started to find that once I began to frame Hemingway's thoughts, ideas, and even his writing in this way, it all just began to pop open, and I began to realize that Hemingway is always talking business. In his letters, it was a good business, it was a bad business, it was a shitty business, because it's Hemingway. It's always business, and he's thinking about what is good business, what is bad business, how we're going to do business, what about the business. It was a dirty business. And these aren't his personal letters. This is how he's actually thinking. He will write about one of his book deals that I had to play the businessman. And this is something that you start seeing him really doing in the 1920s. He was very conscious of playing the businessman when doing contracts. He was also very conscious of being the businessman and playing the businessman when he was agreeing to take out chapters that his publishers thought, you know what, we're not going to get this past the censors. People aren't going to publish this. We don't want to publish this like this. They're not going to want to read it. So he very consciously was working with and manipulating this idea of the businessman as he was manipulating and changing his art, because he still thought he could be a good businessman and a good artist simultaneously. But what will begin to happen as the 20s wear on is he starts to think, you know what, I can't be such a good businessman. I'm not going, I want to continue to make money, and this is a seedy, dirty business. Publishing is seedy and dirty. So I'm going to have to occasionally be a bad businessman. And when I say bad, and when Hemingway would say bad, it would be an immoral businessman, conning people, corrupting people, proverbially shooting Sherwood Anderson down and cutting off his mentor, Sherwood Anderson, because he wants to separate from his publisher and get a new publisher for The Sun Also Rises. So he starts being dirty, being a little bit of a dirty businessman, and we can see that growing and growing. But it's fascinating to me that Hemingway is so conscious of this construct of a businessman, which comes from Chicago, the good businessman and the bad businessman, and who are you going to be? And it was something I think Hemingway continued to wrestle with until 1942 when he was in Cuba. And he'll write in a letter, I'm out of the book business. I'm out of the writing business. And that's how he phrased it. It's all through the letters, and it's all through his novels as well, the damn dirty business. And I started to see how influential Chicago business speak, language, thought about business really was for Hemingway, and that's where the chapter came from.
Well, it's just fascinating to me because I think about this idea of Hemingway wrestling with his morality through his entire career. Mm-hmm. And again, as that relates to the inside versus outside persona, right? Inside, wanting to do good, wanting to be good, wanting to be seen as good, wanting to make people happy, wanting to please. And then his external persona of being rather alienating, mm-hmm. right? His characters are alienating. In his personal life, he was alienating. And when you say that he, said in the 40s that he out of the book business, right? Like, did he have this moment where he's like, what have I done? What have I been doing my whole life? What good am I putting forth if I'm part of all of these problems? And I can imagine that it just would have added to that crisis that he felt seemingly for his whole life, this identity crisis, of who am I? But one thing you did touch upon when you're talking about like Sherwood Anderson, you're talking about the Cliff Dwellers, the literary turf wars right? That the literary scene, that it was this very seemingly seems to be like a lot of backstabbing going on, and a lot of throwing each other under the bus, and kind of you climbing up over each other to get, your success, which, as we know, is not being a good businessman. And I kind of want to turn now to talking a little bit about Harriet Monroe, because if we're going to be focusing on literary turf, I think that she is a good example of somebody who owns the turf, right? So if you could speak a little bit about her.
Okay. Well, Harriet Monroe is, she forms the second chapter of my book, and didn't make it the subtitle, but she is so important because she, as you said so well, Laura, she is the turf. She pushed on the turf, and she created this place for artists to be. Now, she will publish Hemingway's first poems in Poetry magazine in 1923, in the January issue, and it's just 5 very short formed poems, and 2 about his experience at war. But it's said in the lore that he wrote these poems to woo Hadley. They're not very romantic poems, but yet nonetheless, they're formed poetry. And I find it fascinating that he began as a poet. We don't normally think of Hemingway as a poet, but his terseness of writing, his style of writing, is going to be very much linked with these early Chicago poets. So it actually makes sense that, like Edgar Lee Masters, so it actually makes sense that the first place he's published is in Poetry magazine. Monroe starts Poetry magazine in 1913 when she is 53 years old. So it's this next life for her. Most people haven't even heard of her at this point in 2021. She's one of those people that have kind of gone to the wayside or to the side because there's just so much history to remember. But in modernist studies, if she's known and by people, she's known for this groundbreaking poetry magazine that she published, began publishing in 1913 out of Chicago, and with Ezra Pound as her foreign correspondent, her foreign editor. And it was Ezra Pound who found T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and sent it back to Monroe to publish in Poetry magazine as the best example of imagist poetry he could come up with. And Prufrock is just one of those poems that students love and tends to get taught quite a bit in the room. Women come and go, speaking of Michelangelo. But as I said, this is what Monroe was starting when she's 53 years old. And Harriet Monroe was very much in on the beginnings of the Chicago art scene after the fire, and when the Colombian Exhibition had come to be. She was very good friends with Henry Blake Fuller, who had written the Cliff Dwellers that we talked about earlier. And Monroe is fascinating because she really fought for poetry, beginning with declaring in 18, let me get this correct, in 1888, that she is going to write the ode for the Colombian Exhibition. That is absolutely what she is going to do, and she is going to be the one who does it. 1892, sorry. And so in 1892, she starts pulling some strings saying that poetry is where it's at, and poetry is what is going to commemorate the Colombian Exhibition. Her father, at this point, with Henry Monroe, was a very prominent attorney in Chicago. And he was good friends with Burnham, and with John Burnham, the architect, and John Burnham's new partner, Root. Together, they will form the company of Burnham and Root. Burnham and Root got the contract to do the buildings, one of the contracts to do all the buildings for the Colombian Exhibition. So Monroe had an in, not just because her father knew Burnham very, very well, and not just because the family, her family knew Armour Hot Dogs of the meat packing industry, who was a member of the main committee for the fair, but also because her sister Dora fell in love with and married John Root, Burnham's partner. So between all these connections, she was able to get her idea up to the committee, who said, yes, we need to have an ode for the fair. These businessmen who formed the committee had not been thinking about artistry before, and not been thinking about we need to have a poem, and Monroe brought it to them. And of course she said, and I shall do it. I will be the best poet for this. And they said, okay. So she began a series of drafts of the poem, because this group of businessmen who formed the overseeing committee wanted to see everything, wanted to see every draft she had, and they wanted to approve everything. And you can see all of these drafts, and I went through all of them in her archive down at the University of Chicago. And in these drafts, you get all of her notation, all of her changes, as well as her responses to what this committee wanted her to change. All of these businessmen suddenly thought they were literary critics, and what they actually became were the editors from hell. We're going to change this line because it doesn't sound good. Oh, I don't like this word. This is ridiculous. We should change this word to something else. Well, she pushed back. She kept pushing back and said, no, I'm the poet. And there was a series of things that went on where she had to keep pushing back, and she wouldn't take it. Meanwhile, she's forming that club I talked about called the Little Review, not the Little Review, the Little Room, with Fuller and others, as a kind of guild, as a place that artists can band together, kind of an artistic union, to have power and strength to push back against these artists and these businessmen of Chicago. But Monroe is really central to this, because she's pushing back on them as she's writing this ode, and they want to approve every single draft, and then they want to set it to music, and then they have to approve who's going to conduct the music, and it just goes on and on and on. Well, finally, she says, I want to be paid. Oh, no, it wasn't for money. No, I want to be paid, and here's why. You have to remember, this is an attorney's daughter. A woman couldn't have been an attorney at this time, but if anyone could be one, it certainly is Monroe. So she's thinking like a businesswoman. She understands the worth of herself, of her time, and of her art, of her poetry. And so she says, you know what? No, I'm the poet. I have control, and I want you to put it in writing, and I want to get paid. They say yes. They were impressed, I think, with her business acumen. They were impressed with what she was writing lists of demands, and they were meeting them. So then she says, and I'm going to copyright, and I'm going to put it in my name. Now, copyright, when she was doing this, was not the same as it is now. It was theoretically, but it really wasn't shored up. And artists were getting their work ripped off, republished, just reprinted right and left, and there was no international copyright. In fact, Ezra Pound, her international correspondent, became very interested in this idea of copyright, I think, because of what Monroe had gone through at this earlier time. And she's copywriting the poem, and she's going to do it because she wants to declare ownership over it. The thing that she had to keep declaring every time she pushed back on the committee. So she writes away to the Copyright Office, and that's in the works. Meanwhile, all these preparations for the Colombian Exhibition are being undergone, and she's really at pains to keep the poem under wraps, because the newspapers, New York, Chicago, even Europe, they want to publish anything they can get their hands on that has the Colombian Exhibition stamped on it. They just want to publish it. So people were looking to steal this poem early on, and she knew it, and she swore everyone to secrecy. She swore the committee. She was very afraid that one of the committee members was going to take it out from underneath her. One of the reasons why she pushed ahead with the copyright. Well, what happens is that on September 25th of 1892, there's a knock on her door. And the New York World had sent a representative to tell her, we published your poem. They weren't supposed to do that. And we want an interview with you about the fact we just published your poem. What do you think about it? And the story, I can just picture her slamming the door in their face. She turns around, and I'm embellishing a little here, but I'm just picturing she turns around, walks down the hall, and tells her attorney father, who runs this huge law firm in Chicago, what just happened. The two of them push back immediately by suing the newspaper. And you can find her, all of the legal papers down at the University of Chicago. When Monroe published her memoir at the end of her life, she doesn't actually write at length about the lawsuit because she's writing the memoir while she's traveling. So it's the shortest chapter in the book. It's only 6 pages. And frankly, she doesn't remember it very well. She doesn't remember what actually happened. But when you go through the lawsuit, you get all of the details sworn into testimony. And it's amazing because it's it's probably the only time I've ever actually was looking at historical fact, doing archival research, particularly for literary research. So let me share my screen and show you the, let me find it, the lawsuit. Okay, and so her father, Henry Monroe, is going to push back against a press publishing company, and they win. The press publishing company and the paper go so far as to appeal it because she, let me just share my other screen, because they obviously do not like the way that it turned out. And let me find, here we go. Is that the Supreme Court one? Yes. And it gets taken all the way up to the Supreme Court. Monroe wins. And what she wins is the right for artists to own their unpublished work. No one can steal it. Now, the copyright had not been granted yet, which is exactly how the Supreme Court puts it. And so in this case, when it was published, it was still unpublished work. And so the idea that artists could be writing work, writing novels, sending them to a publisher, the publisher says, we're not going to publish it, and then, nope, they do, but they put someone else's name on it, is horrifying. Monroe put a stop to that by pushing this all the way up to the Supreme Court and winning. And so this case, and Monroe's case that pushes back for the rights of artists against businesses who think they can just steal the work and with impunity, is still being cited today as the foundation of American modern copyright law, which I find to be utterly amazing. And so Monroe is really that soil, the ground in Chicago of artists beginning to push back, beginning to have to push back against the proverbial business world of Chicago. Hemingway then is in the next generation. And the fact that he wants to marry both, he wants to be a good businessman, but keep his artistic integrity, can be seen really as this next generation, I think, of Chicago writers, or as a boy who grew up in Oak Park, aware that artists need to stake their ground and say, no, this is what I'm doing. And yet he wanted to make money at the same time, right? There's that conflict. But Monroe is utterly amazing. Her story has unfortunately been lost, and I tried to really bring it back and to preserve it, because copyright law is everything now in 2021. And the idea that this editor of Poetry Magazine actually was able to start Poetry Magazine with respect and stay in Chicago with creating this avant-garde literary journal is amazing to me. And she was able to do so because she earned so much respect from the establishment and the business community, pushing back and pushing her case forward all the way up to the Supreme Court. And she did it while being a woman at the same time, right?
Yes, I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing. And it just, makes me think how many women out there without attorney fathers were, robbed of their work, basically, in so many ways, right? Whether it's having to write under a different name, not being allowed to submit for publication, to like this situation where someone published it without her, without her acknowledgement. And when I think about the Chicago literary scene, which, as I don't know who is out there or where they're from, but it's not vibrant, I would not say. And to think that it once was vibrant gives me hope as a Chicagoland writer myself. But I kind of want to switch gears a little bit and talk about Cather. I wanted to talk about her and her relationship with Elia Peattie. If you could speak to that for a few minutes.
Okay. Elia Peattie was the Chicago Tribune's first girl reporter of 1885. And so she's right there next to Henry Blake Fuller and Harriet Monroe in the little room, forming the little room, pushing back against what they perceived as these giant business industrial forces against the artistic world, against the art world in Chicago. She was a journalist, and she also, in 1889, will write The Story of America. Sort of as a side note, she did the pamphlets for the Northwest Pacific Railroad Wonderland train advertising program. And so she really was very diverse, but she was very much interested in writing of the landscape, writing of Chicago, and being that and she was called this, the first girl journalist. Her husband, Robert, was also in the little room and also was a journalist there right alongside Elia. And when Cather went to the University of Nebraska, and when she graduates in 1895, she meets Peattie, who is doing a book tour, and they immediately take to each other. Cather's very young, just graduated from college, and she thinks Peattie is so cool, and she was. And for Cather, we have a female role model. We have someone who is in journalism, who is forging a way forward, who is in Chicago, not from the small town, and she sees in Petey an opportunity to really have a mentor and to get out of the small town, someone who can follow her. And the Petey, she goes to visit the Peteys in Chicago almost immediately after meeting her. And there then is a couple letters where Cather's going to move to Chicago. She's going to do it, but then she doesn't. And there's no letter that says, here's why I didn't move to Chicago. And that's unfortunately how the archive works. You don't ever get the letter you exactly want. It's how research works. But what is apparent is that she does begin to write about how tired Chicago is making her. And many years later, that is exactly the sentiment that her heroine Thea will have in the Song of the Lark about Chicago too. All the work runs her down. The cold, the grayness, the pushing back, the having to fight is exhausting. And I think it was exhausting for Cather as well. So she doesn't stop in Chicago, that she will visit often. Her good friend Irene Miner from home in Red Cloud, who is the sister of Carrie Miner, who Antonia is based on from I, Antonia. She will visit often, but Cather will continue on to Pittsburgh. But Petey is interesting because that relationship begins to fade away by the time the Song of the Lark is being written. And one of the reasons why is because Petey doesn't want to become modern. Her sentiments are very much like Hamlin Garland's, who started the Cliff Dwellers Club. Both of them were really rather disgusted with nudity in literature. They didn't like descriptions of naked women in literature. They thought it was disgusting. They didn't like that the dirty underground, the muckraking was making its way into fiction. Like in Edgar Lee Masters' Twin River Anthology, where you have these epitaphs from a graveyard, but we're being told the dirty little secrets of a small town in the epitaphs, how people died, the fact that there was abuse happening in families, poisonings, people were married to people they didn't like, they didn't love, affairs, all of that was coming out. Petey didn't like that. And she belonged to this earlier generation where she wanted to continue writing about the land. She wanted to continue writing in this realistic mode rather than shifting to a more modern mode. And Garland felt exactly the same way. And it's important to note at that moment that that's right where Monroe is really starting Poetry Magazine. Monroe loved the new modern art. She reviewed the Armory show when it came to New York, or the Armory show in New York that then came to Chicago. She reviewed it favorably. Petey didn't like it. Hamlin Garland organized a Cliff Dwellers protest outside of it. And so it's at that moment you can really begin to see the breaks, and that's where Cather breaks. And Cather is often thought of as this prairie writer, that she is of the land. She is writing in that earlier realistic mode. But there's nothing that's further from the truth. And the break from Petey actually shows it, that Cather is a modern writer. She is a writer who is interested in looking at what the new modern world is. She is a writer who is interested in pushing back against those earlier 19th century Victorian ideas. And so I think Petey's relationship to Cather can be surprised and unexpected, because again, it's not something that you hear about, that you read about, this idea that not only did Cather was a very good friend with the Tribune's first girl reporter, but that Cather actually considered moving to Chicago, I think is extraordinary. But then the onus for the book is, but she didn't. And I think that there's reasons for it. Harriet Monroe stayed. There's reasons for that. And Hemingway was, of course, forever grappling with his relationship to Chicago for the rest of his life, and doing so in the guise of being a Chicago businessman.
Yeah, and you say somewhere in the chapter on Hemingway that he says after he buries his father here, says, "I'll never come back," and he never does.
But he's with women who do, right? Mary
women who do.
Coming back, and there's extraordinary letters back and forth where Hemingway's writing to Chicago. She's writing back, and something a letter I end the chapter with is he just goes on and on, waxing nostalgic for hot dogs with pickles and the park and on and all the landmarks, all the sights, the smell of the water. He's just absolutely nostalgic, and he remembers it all in clear detail. And this is not a Hemingway that I think most people are aware of. And I find these letters, particularly that one, to be so emblematic of who he was, because there's still Chicago in there. He knows what he's not coming home to. He's still thinking about it, and he can still write a page and a half about everything he misses about Chicago, everything he knew and everything he did and everyone, what it smells like and looks like and sounds like. But he's still not coming back. And I think that's the story of the exile. It's actually a very Joycean story, right? That is the Joycean story. And Hemingway very much admired James Joyce. It's the story. You love it and you can't be there. You are in exile. So the thing you are always writing about is the place you can never go back to. And that right there is the definition of one of the definitions of being a modernist writer.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end the talk than with that description of a modernist writer. Right? Just always trying to attach and tether yourself to a place that no longer exists for you, right? In some fashion. So Dr. Moore, thank you very much for your time. We were happy to have you. And were there any questions? I just wanted to see if there were any questions from the audience members. Many people really enjoyed your Harriet Monroe chapter in your book. And we do have somebody who actually went to the Cliff Dwellers Club and went to a dinner and talk there. So that's kind of interesting. A few years ago. Well, I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of the Hemingway Foundation, and the rest of you who are out there. Thank you for joining us this evening, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.